The gold piece lay in the pay envelope where it had no business being. Ada Kessler stood at the steward's window of the Whitfield County Hospital with the envelope open in her hand and counted its contents for the third time. $4.50, her week's wages as a scrubwoman in the usual worn coins. And beneath them, wrapped in a slip of paper, a $20 gold piece. On the slip, in a narrow backhand script, 4 words: "For faithful service rendered." Below the words, a signature she had seen only on notices pinned to the corridor wall. E. Hale, Superintendent. $20. More than a month of scrubbing floors. She had not asked for it. She had not, so far as she knew, earned it. Or perhaps it only seemed to her that she hadn't. The steward, a stooped man named Pruitt, who kept the accounts and the keys and the opinions of the whole institution behind one pair of smeared spectacles, looked at her over the ledge of his window and shrugged before she had said a word. He told her the order had come down from the superintendent's office with the seal on it, and that it was not his practice to question what came down with a seal on it, and that if she wanted reasons she would have to go upstairs and ask for them herself. Ada folded the envelope twice and put it deep in the pocket of her apron, under the clean rags she kept there, and went back to her buckets. Asking was out of the question. In 9 years at the county hospital she had learned the one law that governed her position more surely than any rule the trustees ever printed. A scrubwoman does not go to the superintendent. The superintendent comes to the scrubwoman, and only when something is dirty. When everything is clean, you do not exist. She had made her peace with that law long ago. She had, in truth, come to depend on it. Her shift began at 5:30, before the gas was turned up in the long corridors, when the building still belonged to the night nurse, the porter, and the sound of its own pipes. Whitfield County Hospital had been raised in 1869 by public subscription and a bequest from a childless wool merchant, and it had been repaired ever since the way a poor family repairs a coat, a patch here when the cloth gave way there, new windows in one wing, and stoves from before the war in the other. The floors of the upper story were pine board, worn pale down the middle of every corridor, like a path worn through grass, and Ada knew every one of those boards the way a ferryman knows his river. The mop handle settled into her right hand at the old place, a hand's width below the middle, where 9 years of mornings had worn the varnish to bare wood. Her fingers had thickened at the joints. She noticed it at home in the evenings, when the teacup no longer fit through the ring of her thumb and forefinger the way it once had. Her right shoulder rode lower than her left now, an inch, no more, from leaning into the work always on the same side. A body keeps its own register. It writes down everything you do 10,000 times, and it never loses the page. She did the men's surgical ward first, then the corridor, then the stair landing. The matron, Mrs. Odell, passed her at 6:15, boots striking the boards in that quick, dry rhythm that the whole second floor obeyed like a clock, cap pinned level, collar shut to the throat. She gave Ada a nod without slowing. "Good morning, Ada. Good morning, Mrs. Odell." That was all, and it was enough. In 9 years the two of them had worn their friendship, if a thing so silent could be called friendship, down to its working parts, the way a tool is worn to the shape of the hand that uses it. Mrs. Odell knew the one thing about Ada that mattered. Ada knew the same about her. Everything else they let alone. Then the West Ward. She pushed the door open with her shoulder and brought the bucket in after her. 8 iron beds, 6 of them filled that week. A farm wife from out toward Harlan Corners sleeping with her bandaged arm laid over her eyes. A mill girl with a crushed foot, awake already, watching the ceiling. An old woman by the window who had been brought in a week ago and had not yet said 10 words to anyone. Ada nodded to her. The old woman nodded back. They had never spoken. The faces in the beds changed with the seasons, but the ritual did not change, and Ada had come to believe the patients understood it the way she did, as something that did not need remarking on. She began at the door, as always, small circles, hard pressure, along the baseboard first. Under the beds with care, minding the legs of the cots and the stands that held the dressings. Down the middle aisle, and then, last, the window end. At the window end she always slowed. The boards there were the oldest in the room, laid when the hospital was built, and in the second board out from the wall, just where the light from the window fell across it in the morning, there was a stain sunk deep in the grain of the pine. It was the color of weak coffee and shaped like a bent branch, and no lie, no sand, no scalding water had ever lifted it in 9 years, because it did not lie on the wood. It lay in it. Ada had asked the steward, in her first year, whether the board might be taken up and a sound one laid down, and Pruitt had told her that boards were replaced when they were broken, and not when a scrubwoman took a dislike to them. So she had stopped asking, and instead she washed that board the way other women tended a grave. Along the grain, then across it, then along it again. The water gathered in the low place at the stained center, and she dried it with a separate rag she carried in her apron pocket, the one that touched nothing else. The old woman by the window watched her work the board over and finally spoke, in the voice of someone who had been saving up the question for days. She asked whether Ada scrubbed like that every day, or only when the committee was coming. Every day, Ada said. The old woman considered that and said it was a queer thing, because in the city hospital where her sister had died, they had swabbed the floor the way a man ties his shoe when he is late, and she had always wondered if that had anything to do with it. Ada made no answer to that. There was no answer to make that she was willing to say aloud. She finished the ward, carried her bucket out, poured the gray water down the sluice, and drew clean. Into the clean water she measured from a brown glass bottle she brought from home in her basket 2 capfuls of carbolic solution. Not the thin, stretched stuff the county bought by the barrel when it remembered to buy it at all, but the proper strength from Fetterman's Pharmacy on Canal Street, 40 cents a week out of her own wages. She had read the labels of every disinfecting preparation Fetterman stocked, standing at his counter in her shawl while other customers bought lozenges and hair oil, and she had settled on this one the way an engineer settles on a grade of steel. Then she went back into the West Ward, 6 beds of surprised or indifferent or sleeping women, and washed the whole floor a second time. The mill girl with the crushed foot raised herself on an elbow and said, plainly enough for the whole ward to hear, that the floor had just been washed, hadn't it? She'd watched it done. It had, Ada agreed. Then why wash it again? Against the fever, Ada said, which was the truth, though not the whole of it, and the girl lay back down with a satisfied look of a person who has received an answer exactly as useful as she expected. So it had gone every working day for 9 years. Nobody had ordered it. Almost nobody noticed it. Only Mrs. Odell had ever asked outright once in the first spring, stopping in the doorway with her arms full of folded sheets to watch the second washing with narrowed eyes. She had asked why the West Ward twice when the county paid for once. It comes cleaner, Ada had said. Mrs. Odell had looked at her for a long moment, the way she looked at a dressing she suspected of hiding something underneath. Then she had nodded, said that it was Ada's knees and Ada's business, and gone on down the corridor. She had never asked again. For that, more than for any kindness in 9 years, Ada was grateful to her. After the shift, she changed in the little room behind the laundry where the scrubwomen kept their things, hung her working apron on its nail, and took from the apron pocket, before she hung it, the strip of linen. It was a narrow band, 3 fingers wide and as long as her forearm, hemmed all around with the smallest stitches she knew how to make, and Ada Kessler had spent 22 years as a seamstress before she ever touched a mop, so the stitches were very small indeed. Along the band, in rows as even as ruled lines, marched little crosses of red thread, hundreds of them. She did not count them anymore. She had a seamstress's eye and knew the count the way a farmer knows his acres. Each cross was a woman who had been carried into the West Ward, cut or broken or opened by the surgeons, and had walked out of it, or been wheeled out of it, or carried out of it on her son's arm, alive and free of fever. When a bed came empty the right way, Ada put a cross on the band that evening at her kitchen table, by lamplight, with the red thread she bought at the same counter where she had once bought silk for wedding dresses. There was no column for the other kind of leaving. In 9 years, in that one ward, she had never needed one. She did not let herself think about that directly, the way you do not look directly at the sun. But she knew it was so, and the knowing was the floor she stood on. The band was nearly full now. 3 or 4 crosses more and she would have to hem a second one. She rolled it, tied it with the thread, and put it in her basket next to the brown bottle. Then she walked home through the dark of a December evening, past the courthouse and the harness shop, and the windows of Corbin's Dry Goods lit up for Christmas, with a $20 gold piece she could not account for lying against her hip like a live coal. The new superintendent had come to Milton Falls in January of that year, 1896, and Ada had seen him for the first time at the General Assembly the trustees called in the dining hall, all the staff down to the kitchen women summoned to stand along the walls while the board sat at the head table with the air of men attending their own portrait. Dr. Everett Hale. She had heard the name for a week before she saw the man. Cincinnati, the nurses said. A hospital man, not a town doctor. had run the surgical service of a big charity hospital there and written things in the medical journals about hospital fevers, which one of the young nurses pronounced with reverence and Mrs. Odell with suspicion. He stood up at the head table that day, a lean man on the far side of 40, with a face that seemed to have been folded once too often, and a thin white seam of a scar splitting his left eyebrow, and spoke for perhaps 4 minutes, which was 3 fewer than the chairman of the board had spoken in welcoming him. He said the roof would be mended first, then the drains, then everything else, in the order that the sick required, and not in any other order. His voice was low and a little rasped, as if he had spent it somewhere. Then he sat down. Ada, standing at the back wall between 2 laundry women, had not listened closely. Superintendents came and went. There had been 4 in her 9 years, each arriving with plans the way spring arrives with mud. The plans dried up, the West Ward remained. Buckets, carbolic, the board with the stain in it, those were her concerns. The men at head tables had never yet had anything to do with them. Mrs. Odell delivered her judgment that evening in the linen room, folding as she talked. Thorough, she said. Asks what things cost and writes the answers down himself. Walked the cellars in his own boots the first day. It might be, she said, in the tone of a woman refusing to hope out loud, that something in this building would finally be mended by somebody. And for a year it was so. The roof over the north wing stopped leaking for the first time since the flood year. The drains were dug out and relaid, and the smell that had lived in the back stairwell longer than Ada had worked there packed up and left like a defeated tenant. The kitchen got a new range. The operating room got new lamps and a sterilizing cabinet of riveted copper that the nurses showed off to visitors as if it were a church organ. And somewhere in that year, between the drains and the lamps, Dr. Hale began pulling the old books. Ada heard of it the way scrubwomen hear of everything, which is sooner than anyone supposes and in the same breath as the price of eggs. The young Irish scrubwoman, Bridget Doyle, brought it into the changing room like news of a fire. The superintendent had sent to the cellar for the ward journals, all of them, going back 10 years and more, and had them stacked in his office in towers and sat with them at night. The duty rosters too, Bridget said, and the matron's daybooks, and the registers from the dispensary, everything with a date and a name in it. What does a man want with 10 years of scrub rosters? One of the laundry women asked, and Bridget said, with the enjoyment of a person delivering the incomprehensible, that nobody knew. Ada, sitting on the bench with her boots half-laced, said nothing at all, but she thought about the rosters. Every ward had its sheet, and every cleaning had its line. The hour of beginning, the hour of finishing, the initials of the woman who had done the work. 9 years of mornings, and on every sheet from the West Ward, twice on every working day, in a hand that made its letters as evenly as it made its stitches. A.K. If a man read those sheets the way he read his own accounts, and everything they said of him argued that he read everything that way, he would see it. He would see that one ward in his hospital was washed twice a day, every day, year upon year, by the same pair of initials, and had been since the spring of 1888. Perhaps he would not notice. What man with a roof and drains and a board of trustees on his hands would sit comparing the scrub rosters of one ward against another? She told herself that, wringing the mop in the gray morning light, and did not believe it. She had heard him speak for 4 minutes, once, from the back of a dining hall, and the one thing she had carried away was that this was not a man who overlooked what was written down. When Clara was hurt, she was 19 years old, and Ada was 43. It was October of 1887, a Tuesday, with the first hard rain of the autumn coming down on Milton Falls since morning. Clara had been walking home from the millinery workroom where she was apprenticed, sharing an umbrella with another girl, when a dray horse coming down the hill by the flour mill took fright at a blowing sheet of canvas and bolted, and the loaded wagon came around onto the sidewalk. The other girl was thrown clear into the mud. Clara was not. Ada was at home when the boy came, standing at her kitchen table cutting bread for supper. She heard it told at the door, "An accident, the county hospital, come quick," and the bread knife slipped out of her hand and struck the edge of the crock, iron against stoneware, one short, dry note. She remembered that sound for the rest of her life. That is how the breaking of a life records itself, not in words, which come later and are wrong, but in some small, accidental noise standing near. She had heard such a sound once before. 7 years earlier, in 1880, a neighbor had come to that same door at 6 in the morning to say that Gustav had been taken bad in the night at the shop, and she must come. Gustav Kessler, cabinet maker, her husband, a broad, quiet man who had crossed from Bremen at 19 with his tools in a sea chest and built up a joinery business one staircase and one church pew at a time. 2 weeks before that morning, he had run a chisel into the base of his left thumb, a nothing, a workman's cut, bound up with a rag and forgotten. Then his jaw had stiffened. Then his back had arched like a drawn bow, and in 4 days of a horror that Ada did not permit herself to remember in any detail, the lockjaw killed him. He was 41. The doctors said such things came of the dirt getting into a wound, and that there was nothing to be done once it had, and they were right, and their being right buried her husband. So when the boy said the words county hospital, something in Ada that had been standing guard for 7 years said very calmly, no, not again, not this one too. She was at the hospital inside of 40 minutes, wet through, her shawl heavy as chain. Clara was already in the operating room. The wagon wheel had gone over her leg below the knee, and the shaft had torn her side. That much a nurse told her, and no more. Ada was put on a bench in the second-floor corridor, a hard pine bench with a rail at the back, across from a wall painted the green of pond water, and there she sat without moving for something over 2 hours, holding her wet shawl in her lap, listening to the rain and to doors. The surgeon came out to her toward 1 in the morning. He was young, 28 she learned much later, though that night he seemed to her neither young nor old, only tired in a way she recognized, tired past his years. A tall, spare man with a thin white scar dividing his left eyebrow, in a gown he had not fully taken off, his hands raw from scrubbing. He told her, plainly and without ornament, that the leg was broken in 2 places and had been set, that the wound in the side had been deep and dirty as street wounds were, that they had cleaned it with every care and closed it, and that her daughter was young and strong, and had come through the operation as well as anyone could ask. Ada nodded. She could not speak at all. The surgeon stood a moment longer, and she saw him begin to say something further, saw his mouth open on the first shape of a word and then give it up. Whatever it was, he put it away, told her the night nurse would find her a chair by the bed, and went back through the door he had come from. Years afterward, she would understand that everything that followed, all 9 years of it, the buckets and the brown bottle and the red crosses on the linen band, had been standing just behind that unsaid word of his, waiting. But that night, it was only a tired young man deciding not to say something, and she thought no more of it than of the rain. Clara was carried up to the west ward and put in the bed at the window end, the last bed on the right, beneath the sill. The ward had the same 8 iron cots then, the same pond green paint, the same old pine floor with the stain like a bent branch in the second board out from the wall, though Ada, that first night, saw none of it. She saw only the small white face on the pillow, and the lamp turned low, and the slow rise and fall of the blanket. The nurses brought her a folding chair, and later, when it was clear she would not go home, a cot from the storeroom. She stayed. She went home once a day to wash and returned. Milton Falls was the sort of town where a widow sitting 3 nights running at her daughter's hospital bed was reported in the neighbors' kitchens with approval, and the approval reported back to her in small loaves and jars of broth left with the porter. Ada ate what was brought and did not notice what it was. For 3 days everything mended. Clara woke, knew her, spoke. She complained on the 3rd day that the splint itched, which the day nurse said was a good sign, and asked for tea with sugar and drank half a cup, wincing, but drank it. She told her mother to go home and sleep in a bed like a Christian. There will be time for beds, Ada said. Clara had her father's way of arguing, which was not to argue, but she reached out with her unbandaged hand and squeezed her mother's wrist, and Ada held on to that squeeze the rest of the night the way a man holds a rope in the dark. On the 4th day, Ada noticed the floor. She noticed it the way she would have noticed a crooked seam, without meaning to, her eye simply catching on a wrongness and refusing to let it go. Under Clara's bed, where the leg of the dressing stand met the boards, there was a patch where the pine was dark and sticky-looking, and around the darkness a faint dried ring, as if something had been spilled there and given a hasty pass with a dry mop and left to be. Not fresh. Days old at the least. Old spilled matter in a surgical ward, an arm's length beneath her daughter's open wound. She looked at it for a long while. Then she stopped the ward maid who came through with the slop pails, a heavy, hurried woman with her sleeves pushed up, and asked her, as gently as she knew how, whether the place under the bed might be given a proper scrub when there was time. The woman looked where Ada pointed, and then at Ada, with the flat, worn look of someone who has been asked all her life to do one thing more than is possible. She said she came to that floor when the roster said, and not when visitors said, and that if every mother in the ward set her to scrubbing, there'd be no end. But she came back within the hour. Ada gave her that, then and always, and passed a wet mop twice across the patch, quick, without kneeling, without soap, from a bucket whose water was already the color of a ditch. The darkness spread thinner and wider and stayed. The woman moved on with her bucket. The whole visit of the mop had lasted less time than it takes to say a psalm. Ada sat with her hands folded and told herself it was not her place. She was a guest in that ward. She was a cabinet-maker's widow who sewed dresses for the wives of men who sat on hospital boards. She knew cloth, not medicine. The nurses were kind. The surgeon came every morning. Everyone said the ward was among the best kept in the county. It would be shameful to fuss. It would be like a passenger seizing the reins. She told herself all of it, in order, the way one recites a lesson. She did not get down and scrub the floor herself. That was the thing she did not do. There was a bucket in the corridor closet not 20 steps from the ward door. Her hands had known how to scrub a floor since she was 8 years old, and she sat in her chair with her hands folded and did not do it. Because it was not her place, and because asking twice would have been rude, and because in 50 places in her mind the word tomorrow was standing about like a helpful stranger. On the 5th day, Clara's fever came. It came the way such fevers come, out of a clear sky in the afternoon. At 3 o'clock, Clara was propped on her pillows, teasing her mother about the gray in her hair. At 7, she was flushed and quiet, and her eyes were too bright, and by 10 the thermometer read 104, and the skin around the wound in her side was hot and tight and beginning to redden along the stitches, and the resident on night duty was sent for and came at a walk that wished it were a run. Wound fever, blood poisoning. The words the doctors used were longer, but those were the words the ward used, and Ada had heard them all her life the way one hears of drownings, a thing that happened, terrible and common, in the space between one Sunday and the next. Now the words came and sat down at her daughter's bed like relations arriving for a burial. The young surgeon with the scarred eyebrow was there within the hour, though it was not his watch. He opened the wound and cleaned it. Ada was sent to the corridor and stood with her forehead against the pond-green wall, and did not pray so much as bargain sternly with a God she addressed as one addresses a bank, and afterward he spoke to her in the corridor. He said the poison was in the wound and might yet be got ahead of. He said the next days would tell. He was honest with her. She saw what the honesty cost him, the way he pressed his knuckle against his jaw between sentences as if holding a door shut, and she was past being grateful for honesty. A nurse, not unkindly in the tired way of a woman saying what she has said 100 times, told her that such things simply happened in hospitals, that they came in with the street dirt or bred out of the air itself, that no one was at fault and nothing was to be done. These things happen. Ada heard that sentence perhaps 30 times in the weeks that followed, from nurses, from the house physician, from the chaplain, from her own sister-in-law. These things happen. It is a sentence built like a roof. Its whole purpose is to keep anything from landing on anyone. She sat by the bed. The fever climbed, broke, climbed again. There were nights when Clara knew her and nights when she called for her father, who was 7 years dead, and directed him about the placement of a window she seemed to see going into a wall. There was a night in the 3rd week, Ada never spoke of it afterward to anyone, and never forgot 1 hour of it, when the surgeon did not go home at all, and the screen was brought and set ready near the bed, folded, leaning against the wall, the way such screens were kept near beds that the staff had begun to make certain quiet arrangements about. Ada sat through that night counting her daughter's breaths. Not to any purpose. There was nothing to be done with a number. She counted because counting was the only work her hands and her head could find in the world, and toward morning she made her bargain plain. Let this one live, and whatever it is that keeps such fevers from the bed, I will become it. She did not know yet what she meant. The words simply arrived, the way the sound of the knife against the crock had arrived, and lodged. Clara lived. She turned the corner in the 4th week so slowly that for days no one dared name it. The wound was opened twice more and drained. She lost flesh until her wrists looked like a girl of 12's. Her hair came out in combfuls from the fevers. She was in the West Ward 11 weeks in all, and when she was carried down the hospital steps in January of 1888, she weighed less than she had at 14. But she came down those steps alive, wrapped in 3 shawls, blinking at the winter sun like a prisoner released, and Ada brought her home in Fetterman's own sleigh, which the old druggist insisted upon, and put her to bed in her own room, and stood in the doorway, watching her sleep until the candle burned down. Then she went to the kitchen and sat at the table where the bread knife had fallen, and she was there when the window went gray with morning. Somewhere in that night, the bargain finished writing itself. She thought of the sticky darkness under the bed, and the ditch-colored water, and the mop passing twice, quick, without kneeling. She thought of herself sitting in her chair with her hands folded, like a woman at a concert, 20 steps from a bucket. No one could tell her, and no one ever did tell her, that the fever had come from that patch of floor and not from the street or the wagon or the air. She understood that honestly and held to the understanding all her life, and it made no difference whatever. Because it might have. Because between might have and did, there is no room for a mother to live. She had sat with her hands folded because it was not her place. Very well. Then she would make it her place, and the question would never arise again. In April of 1888, when Clara could walk to church on her arm and back, Ada went to Mrs. Delacroix's dressmaking rooms over the bank, where she had been first seamstress for 11 years, and gave her notice. Mrs. Delacroix took it as a woman takes a bee-sting, with a short cry and then rapid speech. She said Ada was the best needle in the county, and everyone knew it. She said there would be more money. This was said with the reluctance of a woman opening her own vein, and when money did not answer, she demanded at last to know where Ada could possibly be going. To the county hospital, Ada said. Mrs. Delacroix's face performed several operations and settled on relief. As a sewing woman, of course, linens, mending, perhaps the nurses' uniforms. To scrub the floors, Ada said, and watch the words land the way a dropped iron lands on a parlor floor. She never told Mrs. Delacroix why, nor anyone else. This was the part that those who loved her could not forgive, and those who despised her could not resist. She gave no reasons. A respectable widow, a skilled woman with a trade, hands that had made wedding dresses for 2 of the trustees' daughters, walking out of the workroom and into a scrubwoman's apron at $4.50 a week, at 44 years of age, as if answering a summons no one else had heard. Her sister-in-law Wilhelmina, Gustav's sister, who had married a grain dealer and moved up the hill and been engaged her whole life in the management of the family's respectability, came to the house within the week, sat down at the kitchen table without taking off her gloves, and laid out the case. What Ada was doing was an insult to Gustav's memory. The Kessler name meant something in Milton Falls. Their father had been a master joiner, and their grandfather a church warden in Bremen, and now the wives at her husband's table would be able to say that Gustav Kessler's widow wrung out mops after paupers. If it was money, Wilhelmina said, lowering her voice at the indecency of it, money could have been spoken of quietly. But it was not money, was it? It was some strangeness that had gotten into Ada during the girl's illness, and what it looked like, she said this leaning forward, gloved finger on the table, what it looked like, to people who could see no reason, was that Ada's mind had been touched. Ada let the whole speech reach its end. Then she said that Gustav had built staircases for men who never learned his name, and had been proud of the staircases and not of the men, and that she was her husband's wife. Wilhelmina left, and for 4 years the 2 households exchanged only Christmas greetings, formal as treaties. Ada did not explain to her, then or ever. Explaining was the one payment she could not afford. The reason lived in the same room in her as the counting of breaths, and no visitor was let in there. Clara, too, was given no reason, and Clara was owed one, and this was the debt Ada carried and chose to keep carrying. But 19 is merciful without knowing it. Clara, convalescent, absorbed in the enormous work of being alive, took her mother's change of work the way the young take most things their parents do, as weather. Mother had always been mad for cleanliness. Mother had scrubbed their own stoop the day after the funeral, hadn't she? Mother liked work she could see finished, and 11 years of Mrs. Delacroix would drive anyone to a buck. You always did like things properly done, Mama, she said. And Ada said yes, she supposed she always had, and that was the whole of the lie. 2 sentences, both of them true. The matron who hired her was Mrs. Odell. She was younger then, though no one would have dared say so, and she interviewed scrubwomen at a scarred oak table in the linen room with the air of a magistrate who has seen every crime. She read Ada's letter, looked at Ada's hands, which were a seamstress's hands, and asked why a woman with such a trade wanted such work. The work needs doing, Ada said. Mrs. Odell regarded her for a long moment over the top of the letter. It was the first of the long looks that would pass between them across 9 years, and even in that first one, There was something that understood more than it asked. She had been a matron a long time. Women had come to her before with reasons they would not say. Some of the best she ever had came so. She named the wages, 4.5 a week, and the hours, and said the work was hard on the knees and harder on the pride, and that she would take her on the 1st of the month. The 1st of the month was a Tuesday. Ada was given a gray apron, a cap, 2 buckets, a mop, brushes, brown soap, and the second floor of the East Wing, the men's surgical ward, the corridor, the stair landing, and the West Ward. She has wondered, in the years since, as much as she permitted herself to wonder about anything in that country of her mind, whether Mrs. Odell gave her the West Ward knowingly. The roster could have fallen out otherwise. It never did. That first morning she scrubbed the West Ward from the door to the window the way the roster required, once, thoroughly, and gathered her buckets to go on to the landing. And could not go. She stood in the doorway with a bucket in each hand and could not make her feet carry her out. Down at the window end, in the last bed on the right, beneath the sill, lay a stranger, a stout farm woman with her leg in plaster, and it was not the woman who held her. It was the bed. It was the patch of floor under it, which he had just scrubbed, and which was clean, and which she could not, standing in the doorway, swear was clean enough. What did once mean? Once was the roster's word. Once was the ditchwater mop, the quick pass, the not kneeling. Somewhere under that bed, in the grain of the board, in the seam between the boards, the thing that had nearly taken Clara was either there or it was not, and no power on earth could tell her which. And if she walked out that door with it there, and some other mother came to sit in that chair. She set down the buckets, drew fresh water, and washed the whole ward again, kneeling at the window end, and the fist that had been closed around her chest since October of 1887 opened by the width of one finger. That was the whole discovery, and she made it the first day. The fist opened when she washed the ward the second time, and at no other hour of her life. The first washing was the county's, the second was hers. Hers was the one that let her sleep. So it began, and beginning became the shape of her days, as fixed as the courthouse bell. No one ordered it, and no one forbade it. She was careful to take no minute of it from the county's other floors, which she did faster and better than the woman before her had ever done, so that the roster was always satisfied before the second washing began. Mrs. Odell asked her once, that first spring, and accepted the answer, and stood guard over the arrangement ever after in the wordless way of matrons, steering the steward's questions elsewhere, marking the roster herself some weeks, letting it be understood in the linen room that what the Kessler woman did with her own knees was no one's concern. And the brown bottle joined the basket. That first summer, a spell of wound fever went through the men's ward, 3 cases in a month, one of them mortal. And Ada stood at Fetterman's counter and asked the old druggist what the surgeons in the great hospitals used against the poison of wounds. And Fetterman, who missed conversation in German and had known Gustav, gave her not only the name, but a lecture with diagrams, and ordered her the carbolic preparation he called the honest one. She paid for it out of her wages every week from that week on, 40 cents. She gave up the newspaper subscription and, in lean months, sugar. It was not a sacrifice, it was a premium on a policy. She had once paid 11 weeks at her daughter's bedside for having no policy at all. The linen ban began that autumn. It began almost by accident. The stout farm woman, the stranger in Clara's bed, was discharged sound in September, and Ada, hemming a dress sleeve at her kitchen table that evening, found herself thinking that the woman had gone home to her children with no fever, and that no one on earth had marked the fact, because health keeps no anniversaries. Sickness is all record, charts, certificates, stones in the churchyard, and health goes home on the morning stage and is never written down anywhere. It seemed to her suddenly a great injustice or a great carelessness that there should be no book anywhere in which the woman's ordinary living appeared. There was red thread on the table, left from a Christmas commission years old. She cut a strip of good linen, hemmed it round, and made one small cross at the top left corner the size of a grain of wheat. For the farm woman. Then she sat looking at it for a while, and put it in her apron pocket, and said nothing about it to anyone for 9 years. A cross for every woman who left the West Ward alive and unfevered. It was against her thrift and against her sense, and she could no more have stopped than she could have stopped the second washing. It was the only bookkeeping she had ever done that recorded what did not happen, and what does not happen, she had learned at a bedside counting breaths, is the whole of what a mother prays for. The band filled, cross by cross, season by season, Mill girls and farm wives, a schoolteacher with a burst appendix, 2 nuns from the academy hurt in a carriage overturn, an old woman of 90 who had broken her hip and been expected by everyone but herself to die. Red crosses in even rows, each one a woman walking out of a door. There was no mark for the other thing, because in the West Ward, year following year, the other thing did not come. Fevers came to the hospital. She heard of them through the walls, in the men's wing, in the lying-in room, the way one hears storms across a valley, but the West Ward stayed dry. Coincidence, said the part of her mind that had been a sensible seamstress for 40 years. You cannot scrub away what floats in the very air, and the doctors themselves quarrel about how such poisons travel. Maybe so, she answered that part, and dipped the mop again. She was not conducting an argument, she was keeping a bargain, and the terms of a bargain are not weighed every morning, they are only kept. The years went over her the way water goes over a stone in a creek bed, shaping without seeming to move. Clara mended past all mending, as the young do, until the limp showed only in wet weather, and the scar on her side was a thing she spoke of, to her mother's private astonishment, without darkness, my map, she called it once, tracing it through her dress. It shows where I came through. She finished her apprenticeship and trimmed hats for the carriage trade. And in 1891, in the Lutheran church with half the town's German families in the pews, she married Thomas Voss, a steady young millwright with slow speech and quick hands, who had courted her for 2 years chiefly by repairing things at the house before she noticed they were broken. Ada made the wedding dress herself, every stitch, working evenings through a winter, her old trade summoned back out of retirement for one commission. And if any woman at that wedding had been told that the mother of the bride, in her gray silk, with her small, crooked smile, would be on her knees at 5:30 Monday morning scrubbing a hospital floor with carbolic bought out of her own purse, the woman would have laughed at the teller. Though it was known, of course. In a town like Milton Falls, everything is known and nothing is understood. In 1893 came little August. Gus, they called him from the first day after his grandfather, and Ada learned that a grandchild is a strange arithmetic, a person you love with the whole original terror, but with clean hands, without the guilt, because his keeping is not yours. She kept him Sunday afternoons so Clara and Thomas could walk out, and he learned to say Oma before he said Mama, which Clara pretended to mind. That same year, 1893, the money terror came down on the whole country like weather off the lake. The banks locked their doors in the cities, the mill in Milton Falls ran 4 days, then 3, and the county commissioners, meeting in the courthouse with the long faces of men subtracting, cut the hospital's allowance by 1/3. The superintendent of that period, the 4th Ada had seen, a mild, defeated man who signed what was put before him, cut where cutting showed least. Which is to say, not the coal, which the trustees would feel, and not the kitchen, which the patients' families would smell, but the invisible things, soap, soda. The barrel of county carbolic, thin to begin with, was watered further and then some months did not come at all. 1 scrubwoman in 3 was let go, and the ones who remained were given more floor and the same hours. Bridget Doyle came to Ada in the changing room that autumn, 17 years old, 2 months off the boat that had brought her from a Galway village to a cousin's boarding house on Canal Street, and newly given the whole first floor to scrub alone. She was quick, frightened, proud, and ignorant in the particular way of the very young, which is ignorance with excellent eyesight. She had watched Ada for a month. She wanted to know, she asked it half defiant, braced to be laughed at, why the German woman's wards never smelled like the others, and what was in the brown bottle, and whether it was true, what the porter said, that in Mrs. Kessler's ward the fever never came. Another woman might have given her the bottle's name and gone home. Ada looked at the girl, thin wrists, boots too big, the terrified willingness of the immigrant to do anything completely if someone would only say, "What?" and saw, with a small interior shock she did not examine, something that wanted teaching. So she taught her. Not the reason, never the reason, but the whole craft. Water changed before it graze, never after. The corners first, because whoever shirks, shirks corners. Under the beds kneeling, because a mop at arm's length is a lie told with a handle. The seams of the boards worked along the grain. The window sills, the bed frames, the door handles that every hand in the county touches, and no roster names. How to read a floor, where fever likes to wait. What Fetterman's honest bottle cost, and how to make the county's barrel water do half its work when there was nothing else. Bridget drank it the way dry ground drinks rain, and within a year the first floor began to be spoken of, and the speaking pleased Ada in a place she had thought closed for business. It was also in the hungry year that the visiting committee affair happened, which the linen room remembered long after Ada had ordered herself to forget it. The ladies' visiting committee of the hospital board came through the wards each month, chiefly wives of trustees, in the good faith and good gloves of women doing their known duty. At their head that year was Mrs. Corbin, wife of the dry goods Corbin, a handsome, loud, thorough woman who had made herself, in the famine of 1893, guardian of the hospital's every penny, and who found, one November morning, in the scrubwoman's closet of the second floor, standing in Ada Kessler's basket, a brown glass bottle of first-quality carbolic solution, such as the hospital had not been able to afford since spring. The arithmetic Mrs. Corbin performed was swift and public. Supplies were short. Here was a supply. It stood in a scrubwoman's private basket, under a scrubwoman's shawl. She did not use the word before the assembled corridor, nurses, 2 patients' husbands, the steward, Bridget, white as a sheet, but she held the bottle up and asked, in the carrying voice of a woman accustomed to charity bazaars, how it came to be there, in times like these, when honest institutions counted every drum. The corridor arranged its face and waited. Ada stood with her wet hands at her sides and found that her voice had gone somewhere and left no word when it would return. It was not the accusation that struck her dumb. It was the sudden, vertiginous nearness of the reason, the true answer, standing just behind her teeth after 6 years of silence. I buy it. I buy it myself, 40 cents a week, because 6 years ago, in that ward behind you, my daughter, and she could no more say it in that corridor than she could have undressed there. It was Mrs. Odell who came down the corridor, unhurried, took the bottle from Mrs. Corbin's hand as one relieves a child of an ornament, and said that the preparation was Mrs. Kessler's private property, bought with her own wages at Fetterman's these 6 years for the improvement of the county's floors, and that receipts existed, and that if the committee wished to inspect a scandal, the matron would gladly show them the state of the supply room the county's economies had produced, and the committee might then decide which spectacle wanted its attention more, a scrubwoman spending her own money on the sick, or the commissioners spending nobody's. Fetterman's receipts were produced next day. The old druggist kept books like a Prussian clerk and turned the pages for Mrs. Corbin himself with terrible courtesy. There was no apology. Women like Mrs. Corbin do not apologize. They redirect. Within a month, she was telling the board that the devotion of the humbler staff put the commissioners to shame, without particulars, and Ada's name was never mentioned. And Ada was content beyond expression that it was not. But the corridor had seen. Bridget had seen. And in the changing room afterward, the Irish girl, still shaking with borrowed rage, demanded to know how Ada could stand there and say nothing in her own defense, nothing at all. And Ada, tying her boots, considered the question fairly and answered that a floor cannot be argued clean either. That was the world Dr. Everett Hale walked into in January of 1896. A patched roof over a starved house, a matron holding the second floor together by force of cadence, an Irish girl with a first floor of her own and opinions, a steward with smeared spectacles, and a widow of 52 who was invisible in the exact way that a foundation is invisible. Through his first year, Ada watched the repairs go by like traffic, the drains, the range, the copper cabinet, and minded her floors. Twice in that year she passed him close, once on the stair, where he stood aside to let her and her buckets by, which no superintendent had done in 9 years, and she was so unsettled by it that she forgot to lower her eyes. And once in the West Ward itself, where he appeared without warning on a February morning during her second washing. He came quietly, as it turned out he did everything, with the ward journal under his arm, and stood inside the door. She was at the window end, kneeling, working the stained board along the grain, and she knew someone was there by the change in the room. Wards have a weather, and it shifts when authority enters, and looked up, and it was the superintendent, watching her, with an expression she could not read at that distance and did not try to. Her heart performed one hard stroke, like a fist on a table. The bucket beside her was carbolic water. The first washing was entered on the roster, finished, signed. No rule anywhere forbade a woman to wash a floor twice. She recited all of it to herself in the time it took him to cross half the room. He asked what was in the second water. It was said the way he said everything, low, rasped, without weight, a man asking the name of a tool. Carbolic solution, she said, 1 part in 40. He looked at the bucket and at the board under her hands and at the row of beds for what seemed to her the length of a church service. Then he nodded, a single nod, the kind men give to a fact they are filing, and said unaccountably, "Thank you," and left, and did not ask the question she had braced for, which was why. She did not sleep well for a week after that. It seemed to her the visit could mean nothing good. A dotting man, a man of journals and towers of old books, does not thank a scrubwoman for nothing. He writes her into some page of his figuring, and figures have no mercy and no memory of bargains. She thought of the rosters in his office, 9 years of AK twice a day, and of the fever registers Bridget said he sat up with, and for the first time since 1888, the second washing acquired a witness. And the witness changed nothing. She could no more have stopped than stopped breathing. But she began that winter to wash like a woman being red. In September, Mrs. Odell stopped her in the corridor. Stopped fully, which in the matron's grammar was italics, and said, without preface, that the superintendent had sent to the county clerk for the death and fever records of the whole institution going back before his time. All causes, all wards, 10 years. He was having them copied out into tables, she said, ward against ward, year against year. He had told the head physician he wished to know where in his hospital the fevers lived, and why. Ada went on ringing the mop while everything inside her stood still. "Why does he think they live anywhere?" she said at last. "They tell us the poison is in the air." Mrs. Odell said that the superintendent had been heard to say, in the hearing of the whole medical staff, that the air was even-handed and the death rate was not, and that when a number is uneven, something particular is making it so, and he intended to find every particular in the building. Then she looked at Ada a moment longer, seemed to weigh a further sentence, put it back unspent. That gesture Ada knew from a tired young man in a corridor 9 years before, and went off down the hall, cadence unbroken. October went by, and November, and nothing came. December brought the envelope, and the gold piece, and the 4 words in the backhand script. For faithful service rendered. And 3 days after the envelope, on a Thursday morning in the week before Christmas, the porter's boy found Ada in the changing room at the end of her shift and said the superintendent's compliments, and would Mrs. Kessler come up to the office. The boy delivered the next words carefully, as freight entrusted to him with warnings, at whatever hour should suit her convenience. At her convenience, a superintendent to a scrubwoman. She sat down on the bench with her boots half-laced, and Bridget, beside her, whispered, "Was it about the gold piece?" The whole floor knew about the gold piece. Pruitt had told the porter, and the porter had told the world. Ada said she supposed it was, and heard her own voice arrive from somewhere across the room. She did not go home first, because waiting overnight was beyond her strength. She washed her hands at the laundry tap, took off the gray apron and put on her shawl, and stood a moment with her hand in her basket, touching the rolled linen band, not to bring it. The thought of showing it to anyone alive had never once formed in her mind, only to touch it, the way Gustav had touched the sea chest with his tools in it on the morning he signed the lease of the shop. Then she climbed the stairs to the office floor, where the boards were oak, not pine, and were washed by somebody else. The office was small and warm and looked like a battlefield of paper. Towers of war journals stood along the wall in ranks, flagged with slips. The fever registers lay open on a side table in a bay of lamplight, and on the desk, squared in the middle of the blotter, was a single broad sheet ruled into a table in the narrow backhand of the 4 words, and much worked over. Dr. Hale stood up when she came in. She stopped in the doorway. In 30 years of rooms belonging to other people, clients' parlors, the bank, the courthouse the day Gustav's will was read, no man behind a desk had ever stood up for her, and the fact disordered her more than any summons could have. He asked her to sit. There was a chair placed ready, not opposite the desk, but beside it, at the corner where the table could be seen. She sat with her hands in her lap, and the room was quiet enough that she could hear the coal shifting in the stove, and a clock somewhere, and the faint universal sound of the building she had scrubbed for 9 years going about its evening overhead. He did not make conversation. She was to learn that he never did. He had, instead, a way of laying a thing before you and standing aside from it. He turned the ruled sheet to face her, and asked her to look at it. She looked. Columns and rows, the wards down the side and the clerks' names for them, men's surgical east, women's surgical west, medical, lying in, and the years across the top, 1887 to 1896, and in each square a number. She had kept the books of Gustav's shop once, in another life, and a woman who has kept accounts keeps the eye. She read the table as easily as she read seams. Cases of wound fever and childbed fever, and the rest of the hospital's private plagues, ward by ward, year by year. The men's surgical ward, 4, 6, 3, 5, so on across, 39 in the 10 years, with 2 of the squares circled and a note she could not read. The medical ward, its own steady weather. The lying-in room, numbers that explain things she had heard through walls for a decade. And the West ward, women's surgical, West. The row began like the others, 3 cases in 1887, the year written before her life split. One of the 3, she understood with a distant roaring in her ears, was a girl of 19 with a wagon wound, entered in some clerk's hand in a register downstairs, a single stroke in a column, weighing nothing. Then 1888, 0. 1889, 0. 1890, 0. 1891, 0. 1892, 0. 0, 0, 0, 0. 9 squares, 9 zeros, ruled and inked, and each one checked with a small tick as a verified figure, marching from the spring she had first knelt at the window end, unbroken, to the month in which she sat in this chair. She had known it. Of course she had known it. She had a band of linen in her basket that was nothing but the knowing of it, cross by red cross. But she had known it the way one knows one's own prayers, inwardly, in the dark of herself, never once from outside. Set out on ruled paper in a stranger's ink, in a lamplit office, with the tick marks of a man who verified everything, her 9 years stood there in the middle of the table, like a door standing open in a wall where no door was, and the sight of it emptied her lungs. Dr. Hale let the silence stand a long moment. Then he said that he had found this row in October and had assumed a copying error and had the registers researched twice by different clerks against the admission books and the physician's notes and the burial records, because in his experience rows of zeros were made by lazy pens far oftener than by Providence. The row had survived every check. One ward of his hospital had gone 8 years and some months without a single case of the fevers that visited every other ward as regularly as quarter days, through the same surgeons, the same seasons, the same crowded years, the same air. Then he had taken up the scrub rosters, he said, to see how that ward was kept, and he laid his hand flat on the nearest tower of journals without looking at it, and had found that for those same 8 years and some months, 6 mornings a week, the West Ward alone of every room in the building had been washed twice. Same hour, same initials. He turned his eyes to her then, she had the impression it cost him something, and said that he had watched her do it one morning last February, and had seen the second bucket dressed with carbolic at her own expense, which the matron had since confirmed, along with the length of the practice, the affair of the visiting committee, and the fact that no order, no physician, and no superintendent in 9 years had ever once required any of it. He was not asking a question yet. She saw that he was laying his facts in a row as he had laid his zeros, and she sat still inside her shawl, hands folded, and let him. Then he asked it. Why? She did not answer. She looked at her hands, the enlarged knuckles, the shine of old lye burns, the smell of carbolic that lived in the creases now and came home with her and lay down in her bed, so that Clara said, not complaining, that her mother always smelled the same, winter and summer. She had carried the reason for 9 years the way she carried the separate rag, in a pocket that touched nothing else. It had never once been spoken aloud, not to Mrs. Odell, not to Fetterman, not to God in any words. She found she could not begin. There was no beginning to it that did not open in a kitchen with a knife striking a crock. The superintendent waited. He was good at waiting. She would think, later, that he had had 10 years' practice at this particular wait. When it was plain she could not speak, he did the strangest thing yet in that evening of strange things. He answered for her. Quietly, not looking at her, looking at the ruled sheet between them, he said one word, and then 3 more. Kessler, he said. The West Ward. October of 1887. The stove shifted. The clock went on. Ada sat absolutely still, the way one sits when a floor has moved and may move again. He said, I operated on your daughter. And then she saw it. Saw what 9 years and the office and the title and the gray in his hair had kept her from seeing across a February ward or a stairwell. The lean height of him folded now into heaviness, the split eyebrow with its thin white seam, and, as he turned toward the lamp, the thing she had never forgotten without knowing she remembered it. The mouth opening on the first shape of a word and giving it up. A tall, spare young man in a half-shed gown in a corridor at 1 a.m, telling a woman with a wet shawl in her lap that her daughter had come through as well as anyone could ask. Beginning to say something further, putting it away. "You," she said. It was every word she had. He told it plainly, in order, the way she was to learn. He told everything, and his voice stayed level in the manner of a thing carried carefully because it is full. He had been house surgeon at Whitfield County 2 years when the Kessler girl was brought in. He remembered the case, he said, every case of that autumn, but hers beyond the others. The wagon wound, the setting of the leg, the deep contamination of the side. A good operation, he had believed then and believed still. And on the 5th day, the fever, and the 3 weeks that followed, and a girl of 19 lying in the bed by the window with her mother beside her counting. He stopped there, only for a breath, and Ada understood that he had seen her counting, some night among those nights, from the doorway, and had never said so to a living soul either. But that was not the confession. The confession was smaller and worse, and he made it without lowering his voice and without once forgiving himself in the telling. He had known about the floors. All that autumn he had known. He was fresh from his training and from the journals. Edinburgh and Glasgow were in every number that year. Men were washing wounds and instruments and their own hands in carbolic and watching the old bedside plagues retreat, and he had walked the wards of Whitfield County with his new knowledge and seen the ditchwater buckets, the dry-mopped corners, the ward maids racing a roster that no human legs could satisfy, the darkness under the beds of women whose bodies had just been opened. He had seen specifically, he said this looking at her, and the level voice roughened by one grain, he had seen the floor under the bed at the window end of the West Ward on the 4th day when the Kessler girl's dressing was changed. Seen it, noted it as wrong, and walked on to his next case. Because he was 28 and the newest man in the building, because house surgeons who lectured matrons about mop water became famous in ways that ended careers. Because the senior physician thought carbolic a fashion and said so at table. Because the floors were the stewards and the scrubbing the maids, and the wound, when it turned, could be honestly written up to the street and the wagon and the air, and was, and everyone said such things happened, and he had stood in the corridor at 1 a.m. on the night it began, with the girl's mother in front of him, and had started to say, he did not know to this day exactly what, that the ward wanted better keeping, that she should watch what touched the wound, something, anything, and had looked at the exhausted woman on the bench and told himself it would only frighten her to no purpose, and had put the sentence away and gone home. The girl lived, he said. He had followed the case to discharge, and then made himself stop following it. And in the spring he had left Milton Falls for Cincinnati, a better post, everyone agreed, a step no one questioned, and if anyone had asked him under oath, he would have sworn the departure had nothing to do with a ward floor, and he would have been lying and not known it. It took him years to know it. In Cincinnati he had gone into the fevers the way other men go into railroads or religion. Hospital gangrene, childbed fever, wound fever, the diseases the profession had agreed to call the air's fault. He rebuilt the surgical service there around Lister's methods when half his colleagues called it foreign superstition. He wrote the papers the young nurse had pronounced with reverence. He made himself, one carbolic washed ward at a time, into the kind of man who could never again walk past a floor. And every paper he wrote, he said this without drama, as a fact among the others. Every one had been, underneath its tables, a letter to a bench in a second-floor corridor, begun in October of 1887 and never yet delivered. When the Whitfield County superintendency fell vacant, he had applied for it against the advice of every friend he had. A step down, they told him. A patched county house in a mill town, a man of his standing. He came anyway because the debt was here. He had expected to pay it with drains and copper cabinets. Then in October, in the third tower of registers, he had found a row of zeros beginning in the spring of 1888, and had checked it twice because he checked everything, and had sent for the rosters, and had sat in this office at midnight with the two facts in front of him, a fever that had never once returned to that ward, and a pair of initials that had never once left it, and had understood with his own arithmetic in his own hospital that for 9 years the debt he had come back to pay had been getting itself paid. 6 mornings a week, on her knees, at 40 cents a week out of $4.50, by the mother of the case. He had needed 2 months, he said, to decide what a man does with such a discovery. The gold piece had been a coward's first installment. Money because money was what an institution knew how to send. Unsigned reasons because he had not yet had the courage for signed ones. He asked her pardon for it. The room was quiet. Ada looked at the row of zeros on the ruled sheet and at the towers of journals where 9 years of her mornings stood flagged with slips, and discovered that she was not going to weep, which surprised her. The feeling was in a country past weeping, where the ground is very still. "I mopped floors," she said finally. "It is not a thing to ask pardon of." "No," he agreed, "it was not." And then, in the level voice, he told her what it was. 39 cases of wound fever in the men's ward in 10 years, he said, and upward of 20 in each of the others, and in hers, none. And every case was some weeks of some family's terror, and some of the cases were the screen brought to the bedside, and some were the burial register. He had the numbers, and she did not want them. Whatever fraction of that difference belonged to her buckets, and he was a careful man, he would not claim to weigh it. There were women alive and walking about the county, women neither he nor she could name or number, who owed the walking to a scrubwoman they had watched from their pillows and forgotten by supper. A heroic thing, he said, is done once, on an occasion, with witnesses. What she had done had no occasion and refused all witness. It was done again the next morning, and the next, for 9 years, and that was not heroism. He had no word for it. In his profession, he said, when a thing worked every day for 9 years, they stopped looking for the word and called it practice. Ada heard all of it, and inside her, quietly, a woman he could not see stood in a doorway with a bucket in each hand and declined the whole speech. Because he had the thing wrong way about, and she alone in the world knew it. He saw devotion, she knew the debt. He thought she had spent 9 years saving other women's daughters. She knew she had spent them washing one floor, the same floor, the 4th-day floor, the one she had sat beside with her hands folded like a woman at a concert, while the darkness under her daughter's bed did its work. No one had ever proven to her that the fever came from that patch of boards, and no one ever could, and it made no difference. She had been 20 steps from a bucket, with hands that had scrubbed floors since she was 8, and she had minded her place. All the mornings since were that one morning done over. Every second washing was the same single washing, the one she had not done, performed 9 years late and 9 years running, the way a debt is serviced that can never be discharged. She was not the hospital's benefactress. She was its longest-standing debtor, keeping up her payments. She did not say this. She had carried it too long to spend it in an office. But something of it must have showed, because Dr. Hale, watching her, said gently, and with the particular authority of the only other person alive who had stood in that October, that he had spent 10 years learning one thing about such accounts, and would presume to report the finding. They could not be paid backward. Not by him with a county appointment, not by her with a bucket. Backward there was only the corridor, and the two of them in it, each with a sentence unsaid. The payments only counted forward. Hers, he said, nodding at the ruled sheet, had been counting forward for 9 years whether she knew it or not. The zeros were not a monument to the 4th day. They were 8 years of mothers who had never sat counting breaths at all, and did not know such counting existed, and never would. Then he told her why he had sent for her, the business part he called it, and became businesslike in the way of a man granting himself cover. He was drafting new standing orders for the keeping of the wards. The whole regimen, the second daily washing of every surgical ward, carbolic solution at fixed strengths bought at hospital expense, the corners and seams and bed frames and door handles written into the roster with hours enough to do them honestly. The water changed before it grayed, all of it, and he intended to submit the same scheme to the State Board of Charities, which was preparing model regulations for every county hospital in Ohio, and which listened to him since the Cincinnati papers. He had the science of it, he said, and the authority for it, and the figures to defend it. What he did not have was the craft. The 10,000 particulars that lived in the hands and could not be got out of journals. How long a floor of old pine actually took, kneeling. Where shirking hid. What a roster must say so that a tired woman at the end of her strength still did the corners. What the county's watered barrel could and could not be made to do. That knowledge existed, so far as he had been able to discover, in exactly one place in the county, and he was speaking to it. He wished to write the ward-keeping orders with her, sentence by sentence, at a table, at proper additional wages, and when the State Board's men came down in the spring to see the scheme working, He wished the West Ward to be shown them by the woman who kept it, under her own name. Ada sat with this for a while. Outside the window it had begun to snow, and the lamps of Canal Street came on one by one through it. She said at last that she was a scrubwoman, and it was not her place, and stopped. Because the sentence, launched by 50 years of habit, arrived nowhere. She had built her place. She had built it kneeling, morning by morning, at the window end of the West Ward, and the man across the desk had found it entered in 10 years of registers, ticked and verified. It was hers, and she could not now plead herself out of it. Dr. Hale saw her hear her own sentence fail, and had the grace to look at the snow. She said she would come to his table. Then, because the whole evening had been made of things said plainly at last, she asked her one question, the only one she had, and it had waited 9 years, standing behind her teeth in the corridor of the visiting committee, lying under every zero on his ruled sheet. She asked whether he believed, as a man of the journals, not as a kind man, that the fevers came from the floors, whether it had mattered, whether any of it, the buckets, the brown bottle, the 2 washings, had ever been anything more than a widow keeping a bargain with the dark. He took the question with the seriousness she had asked it, and gave her the honest answer and not the kind one, and the honest answer took a moment because he assembled it like a dressing. What the science knew, he said, was this. The poisons of the fevers were living things, small past seeing. They did not float in the general air as his teachers had preached. They lay and multiplied in matter, in wounds, in dressings, on hands, on instruments, and in the wet and dirt of exactly such places as an unscrubbed floor beneath a draining wound. What no science on earth could do was travel backward up 9 years and name the birthplace of one fever in one girl in October of 1887. That door was shut and would stay shut. But if she was asking whether a woman who scoured that harbor twice a day with carbolic every day for 9 years had been fighting the real enemy in the real field, then the row of zeros was sitting on his desk, and he had checked it twice, and he was prepared to defend it before the State Board of Charities as no coincidence but a demonstration. The cleanest demonstration, he said, that he had encountered in his professional life. A bargain with the dark, kept in the light, was how he put it finally. Medicine had a long history of those. Some of them, later, turned out to have been the truth arriving early. Ada stood to go. At the door, with her hand on the latch, she turned. She had not planned it. The words were simply there, the last unsaid sentence in the building, and thanked him. Not for the gold piece, she said, for the operating room that night. The operation had gone well. She had never had the chance to say so. For a moment the superintendent of Whitfield County Hospital stood behind his desk with the face of a house surgeon of 28 and his jaw set hard, and he turned his eyes to the window where the snow came down. He said her daughter had done him the honor of living. He said it was the case he was proudest of, and the sentence had taken him 10 years. She went out and closed the door softly behind her, as she closed all doors in that building, from long habit of the sleeping. She did not go straight down to the street. Her feet took her the other way, up the half-flight and along the second-floor corridor, past the men's ward, past the landing she had scrubbed that morning, to the door of the West Ward. It stood shut. The lamps were down. Through the glass she could see the low nightlight burning at the nurse's table and the 8 beds in their 2 quiet rows, and at the far end, under the window, the last bed on the right. A shape asleep in it, the old woman who never spoke, breathing slow and even under the county blanket. Beyond her, invisible in the dark, the second board out from the wall, with its stain like a bent branch, which had been there before Ada and would be there after, and which was, as near as she could say, the axis her life had turned on for 9 years, hers, and, she now knew, a man's 2 floors down, who had circled back a decade and 400 miles to the same few square feet of pine. She laid her palm flat against the doorframe. The wood was cool and smooth, painted and repainted. Her hand knew it in the dark the way it knew the mop handle, the way it knew the stain's low center where the water pooled. 10 years ago, on the other side of this door, a girl of 19 had lain in that window bed with the poison in her blood, and a woman had sat beside her counting, and the counting had felt like the end of the world. It had not been the end. It had been, she stood in the dark corridor and let herself see it whole for once, a beginning so disguised as ruin that it had taken a stranger's ruled sheet to show it to her. Every morning since had risen out of that bed, the buckets, the band of crosses, Bridget's fierce, clean first floor, 8 years of women going home unmarked to houses that never learned what they had been spared. All of it had walked out of the West Ward on the arm of one surviving girl. Somewhere below, a door, the porter making his round. Ada took her hand from the frame and went down and out into the snow. Clara came on Sunday with Thomas and little Gus, as she came every Sunday, and while the millwright and the boy were occupied in the yard with the important work of knocking icicles off the eave, mother and daughter sat in the kitchen with coffee, and Ada told her. Not all of it. Some rooms she would keep locked while she lived, and the counting of breaths was in one of them. But she told her what a listening town would shortly make it kind to have heard first at this table. The fever tables, the row of zeros, the new standing orders she was to help write at proper wages, the State Board's men coming in the spring to be shown the West Ward by Mrs. Kessler. And when Clara set down her cup and asked slowly, a grown woman arriving at a door she had walked past her whole life, whether this was why, all those years ago, her mother had left Mrs. Delacroix's for a scrub bucket, whether it had been about her, about that autumn, about the ward, Ada looked at her daughter's face, the good, strong, recovered face with her father's eyes, and made the last decision of that long week. Yes, she said, it had been about the floor of the ward where you nearly died, and about your father's cut thumb, and about a woman who sat still when she should have knelt. It was the whole truth in 3 clauses. And it was the first time in 9 years the reason had been out of doors. Clara did not exclaim and did not weep, though her eyes shone. She was quiet a moment, and then she reached across the table, the same gesture, across 10 years, the unbandaged hand closing on her mother's wrist, and said that she had always told people her scar was the map that showed where she came through. She had never once thought to ask who had kept the road open behind her. In the yard, a triumphant crash of ice, and Gus shouting, and Thomas laughing, and life going on at the volume of life. Clara went to the window to admire the destruction, and Ada watched her walk, the old limp faint in the cold weather, no more than a signature, and thought that of all the crosses on the linen band, the first one had never been stitched. She had begun the band with the stout farm woman in the autumn of 1888, the girl who had walked out of the West Ward in January of that year, 3 shawls deep, blinking at the sun, had never been entered. Some accounts are not kept because they cannot be closed. That evening, after they had gone, she sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight with the band unrolled before her and counted the crosses for the first time in years. 211. 3 empty places remained at the bottom edge, and the mill girl with the crushed foot was mending fast, and the farm wife's arm was healing clean, and the old woman by the window had begun that very week to complain about the porridge, which Mrs. Odell called the surest sign of recovery in the medical sciences. The band would be full by Candlemas. Ada smoothed it flat, and then, from her work-basket, she took her shears and a fresh width of linen, good linen, the last of a bolt bought in another life for a trousseau, and cut a second strip and threaded a needle and began to hem. The red thread was nearly out, she noticed. A few crosses' worth remained on the wooden spool that had lasted, unbelievably, since before the wedding dress. She turned the spool in her thickened fingers and set it where she would see it in the morning. Fetterman's counter no longer sold silks. She would have to go to Corbin's for it, and Corbin's clerk would wrap the little skein in brown paper and never wonder, and that was as it should be. Monday came at 5:30, black and cold, with new snow squeaking under her boots the whole way up Canal Street. The hospital stood in the dark with its 2 night windows lit, breathing its coal smoke, holding its sleepers. In the changing room she put on the gray apron. The separate rag went into the right pocket, the band, rolled and tied, into the left, over the new hemmed strip with its 212th cross waiting to be earned by somebody now asleep. She filled the first bucket, county water for the county's washing, and set the brown bottle where her hand would find it for the second. Then Ada Kessler shouldered open the door of the West Ward and knelt down at the top of the room, by the baseboard, in the corner, where whoever shirks, shirks first, and began, as she began every morning, and meant to begin every morning she was granted, at the place where the light would come in. The end.